Thank you. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here to moderate this morning's session, which is looking at climate and nature. Where are we and what actions can investors take? Now, as we just heard, we are facing a planetary crisis, both of climate change and in terms of nature and biodiversity loss. These individually, and even more so together, represent material financial risks for investors. But also, ultimately, they threaten the livability of our planet. The good news is action is happening. The bad news is it's not enough, and it's not happening fast enough if we are to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And at the same time, we need to be halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030, in line with the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that was agreed last December. And we cannot tackle climate change first and think about nature later. Why? Well, the science is very clear. These planetary issues are interconnected. You cannot tackle climate change without also protecting biodiversity and the vital natural carbon sinks on which we really do depend. So if we think about the oceans, for example, they produce half of the world's oxygen, and they also store 25% of all carbon emissions. Equally, we can't tackle biodiversity loss without tackling climate change. So they're very much part of the same package, two sides of the same coin. The other element of this, as we heard very clearly in yesterday's plenary session, is if we want to have a fast and orderly transition to sustainable economies which support long-term value creation, we can only do that if we have a fair and equitable transition. Now, this can feel daunting, trying to think about all of these different interconnected challenges, but at the same time, there are so many synergies and efficiencies to be had by looking at it in that holistic way. And that is very much the focus of our panel this morning. So on that, I would like to introduce our panel members. Hishida-san, President of Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Asset Management, one of the largest asset managers in Japan. Very good to have you. Jan Rasmussen, the Director of ESG and Sustainability at Pension Denmark, one of 50 of the largest pension funds in Europe. Ueyama-san, Vice President ESG of Kao Corporation, a Japanese chemical and cosmetics company with, I believe, over 35,000 employees across the Kao Group. Good to have you. Heather Wright, Vice President Markets at World Wildlife Fund, the US. The WWF is one of the world's leading conservation organizations, working in, I think, over 100 countries now and with around 5 million global supporters. And of course, Tony Golding, Executive Director of the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, a market-led, science-based and government-supported global initiative. Many thanks all of you for joining us this morning. Now, to help set the context for our discussion this morning, my colleague Ben Allen, the Director of ESG Issues at PRI, met a few days ago with Professor Jim Skier. Professor Skier is the new chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the UN body that assesses the science on climate change. To hear his views from a science perspective, both on why and how we can limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. If we can have the video now, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Allen. I am the Director of ESG Issues at the PRI, and with me today is Professor Jim Skier, who's the new chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Professor Skier, welcome to PRI in person, and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to share your insights with us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm pleased to be here.
Wonderful. I'll dive straight into the questions. I know your time is precious, and I know our audience want to hear you speak rather than me. So I'll start with a question about where we are on our global emissions trajectory. A growing number of leading scientists have said it is now almost inevitable that the world will exceed the 1.5 degree threshold of warming this century. With some warming, it will occur within the next decade. What then, in your opinion, are the risks associated with such a temperature rise beyond that lower limit in the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, just to say to start with, we have very carefully calibrated language in IPCC for talking about the likelihood that certain things will happen. And I have to say the phrase almost inevitable is not part of our calibrated language. So if I can just say precisely what we did say on that.
Absolutely.
The latest report said that it was more likely than not that we would reach 1.5 degrees of warming by the early 2030s, and that it would be likely or very likely that we would exceed these 1.5 degrees if we did not take ambitious action. So that's the status, of the actual what IPCC actually said. So this question of going beyond 1.5 degrees, if it were to happen, I mean, the evidence from the latest reports are that risks progressively increase if global warming moves up from 1.5 to 2 degrees. And we picked out some very specific things in the report: degradation of permafrost, biodiversity loss, more extreme weather events, and we've seen enough extreme weather events already this summer, and potentially even threats to the productivity of food systems. So the IPCC reports have been quite clear about it. The risks really escalate between 1.5 and 2 degrees.
Wonderful. And thank you for that clarification. I think the language around these things is so important when we're talking about science and evidence. So if we do exceed 1.5 degrees of warming, how should we as a global community respond? What does the science tell us about that possibility of still stabilizing to 1.5 by the end of the century?
Well, just to say, if at any point we do exceed 1.5 degrees of warming, I mean, I think the message is keep calm and carry on with ambitious climate action, because the clear message from our recent reports is that every fraction of a degree of warming makes a difference. And there is no point at which we should be giving up. You know, our efforts to reduce emissions will always bear fruit, no matter where we are. Now, one of the things that has come up very much is the so-called concept of overshoot, which you introduced in the first question. And just to say, overshooting something and coming back again is much worse than actually restricting to that level within the first place, because there may be impacts that are irreversible once you go beyond a certain level. So it is certainly possible to bring, at least in principle, to bring global temperatures down again should we exceed 1.5 degrees. But it would involve removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And just to say, there's much more science to be done on this, because we don't actually fully understand yet how the Earth system would respond if we were to take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere rather than putting it in. We also don't understand all the questions about the reversibility or the irreversibility of particular impacts. And I'm sure we'll get onto this, but there are also uncertainties about the application of carbon dioxide removal methods as well. So it is possible in principle, but there's more science to be done on that, I think.
So prevention better than a cure then in this.
Absolutely. Let's get it right from the beginning, as it were. Yeah.
Very much agreed. So in terms of action then, where are we, do you think, now on climate action? So both mitigation and adaptation, and what do you think is needed from governments, and particularly from the financial sector, which of course is of interest to our signatories and investors?
Yeah, well, clearly the action, that we've taken so far, it's welcome, but it's not enough. We've bent the trend on emissions, but we have still not got emissions onto a downward path. And in a sense, I'll talk about the mitigation side of it first of all, but I think in some ways we have done the easier parts of the mitigation agenda. We've had big successes in terms of renewable energy, with wind and solar, say now about 10% of global electricity generation. We're making movement on electric vehicles and electrification of other kinds of demand for heating, for example. But I have to say some of the trickier parts of it that are coming back are things that would touch people's lives a bit more directly. Also, as we move into more land-based measures, where you get very much tied up with questions of land tenure, land ownership, which is going to be much more difficult. So we've had successes so far, but we really need to step it up and expand the scope, I think, of the action on mitigation. And on adaptation, which is also an essential part of the picture because we are still warming. We can see the effects of climate change already. If anything, the gaps on adaptation are bigger than the gaps on mitigation. For mitigation, we've got real drivers for commercial activities in the form of carbon pricing, for example. So people can go to their shareholders, they can raise the funds for the measures. Adaptation is much more a kind of public good article. And many of the actions may need to be taken at a much more local level. So there, I think the challenges are bigger, and it will certainly be a big part of IPCC's activities in the next cycle, which we're just starting.
Wonderful. So I think that's a really useful segue then into solutions, because I think we all need to focus a little bit on solutions and hope. So if I may, there's two elements to this which I think I'd like to cover. One is nature, which is increasingly recognized aspect of the climate debate in general, both the impacts on nature and also the potential for nature to act as a solution, such as capturing more carbon in biomass and in the ground, but also technology as well. You touched on the potential need for technology in a future scenario. So what more is needed of both of these, and how would you see them working together, if at all?
Yeah, and just to flag, I think in terms of nature, I think we need to recognise that the world is facing, sort of interconnected crises around climate and biodiversity. And we have a sister assessment within the UN that looks at biodiversity and ecosystem services, with whom we have collaborated over the last 2 to 3 years. So nature is going to have to play a role in there. And of course, we are removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere at the moment through avoided deforestation and reforestation. And that, in fact, is the biggest chunk at the moment of carbon dioxide removal. So in a sense, if you can call avoided deforestation and reforestation nature, at least it's biological, if you see what I mean, then it's already playing a role. But there are many other techniques that can be used. For example, with agricultural practices, it's possible to build up more carbon in soils. And that has a twin benefit because it takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but it also can make agricultural systems more resilient against climate change as well. So it kind of contributes to adaptation and mitigation. And there's a lot of interest, for example, in restoring wetlands, peatlands as well, which will also, re-wetting them, will also take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So there's a lot more work to be done there. But so far, the solution set there has been restricted to forestry, but it could go much further. And on the technological side, I mean, all of the scenarios that IPCC assesses use to some degree carbon capture and storage, whether it's with fossil fuels or whether it's with bioenergy. And also the models that now incorporate it also have direct air capture of carbon in there as well. So this is a kind of probably a longer term play, because these are big fixed technological solutions that might take longer to implement. But all of the scenarios we are assessing show that technological solutions for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere or from flue gases have a role to play. Worthwhile saying this will not necessarily be uniform throughout the world. Different countries will choose different mixes of solutions, but globally, certainly part of the picture.
Wonderful. And again, I think that avoiding deforestation is again a nod to the prevention better than a cure in this context. Thank you for drawing those two elements together, which are often talked about separately. Final question really for you is, we can all do with a bit of hope. I mentioned this earlier when talking about these topics and when we read the reports. So as the new chair of the leading authority on climate change, what gives you optimism that the international community will deliver on the Paris Agreement? And what would you see as role of organizations like the PRI and institutional investors in supporting and enabling that change?
Yeah, well, just to say, I think it is very important that we don't despair and give up on hope, because we do have the solutions available if we choose to use them. And, we've given the strong message, that as human beings, we have agency over our future. We can make a difference with the tools that we use. So the optimism about delivering on the Paris Agreement, I mean, we wait with bated breath to see how COP28 actually plays out. The optimism, I think, comes from the fact that we have seen successes. I've mentioned already renewable energy, electrification, some progress on the forestry side as well. But I do think, we don't want to be too optimistic. Complacency is also a risk, and we do need to up our ambition. We need to expand the scope of the measures we put in place. Renewable energy has so far been deployed in developed countries and some other countries with mature electricity grids. Many developing countries will need investment in energy sector infrastructure to allow renewable energy to come through. So although I think we always keep perked up and try to be optimistic about it, that doesn't mean we can be complacent. Much more action is actually needed. Now, one thing that I would flag on, for example, on investment, and I've mentioned this already, the big successes we've had around renewable energy, and that is, I hate to say this because people in that industry do a great job, but it is a little bit the easy bit, because people sitting on a board can make big decisions to get a gigawatt size offshore wind farm in place, and just a few decision makers can make that happen. The challenges that we are about to face are much more about smaller scale projects at the level of households or individual landholders or land managers, where the projects may be in the tens of thousands of dollars, for example, and getting that connection between the institutional investors and the needs on the ground. There's a big challenge there about aggregating smaller scale projects into packages that are financeable. And for me, that is the big challenge for the future. And I do hope your signatories can think about that challenge and start to address it.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I think that will be something that we'll talk about in the panel discussions a bit later. Professor Skier, thank you so much again for taking the time to talk with us today and share your thoughts, insights, and give us some hope for the future.
Okay, thank you for having me.
So huge thank you to Professor Skier for that, and really setting the context for this discussion, which is the urgency of action as we are heading ever closer to the 1.5 degrees. So on that, Jan, can I maybe start with you? As an asset owner with net zero commitments and a member of the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, how is Pension Denmark looking at this global planetary crisis? And in particular, thinking about that point on the urgency of action, given that we are getting very close now to the 1.5 degrees?
Yes, Pension Denmark is currently committed to 1.5 through all our investment universes. But of course, it gives stuff for thought that the IPCC say that with the current climate policy environment, we will more likely than not reach 1.5. And we, of course, have to consider that moving forward. When we look at our reduction targets, in the short term, they include a reduction of the climate footprint from our listed portfolios of equity and corporate bonds from 2018 to 2024 with 45%. And we are pretty close to reach that. It's also in the end of next year. So I think we will stick to that very short-term target. Our 2030 target for those portfolios is a further reduction in the climate footprint with 30%. And if policy action is not improved, I think it's very much in the balance if we can we can keep on working with that target. After 2030, I think it is impossible at the moment to make very precise targets. Of course, we are on net zero before 2050, but what happens in the 20 years after 2030, it's too uncertain for us to make any set any clear targets there. The other part that we have to, where we have to take into consideration is that we are a huge investor in climate solutions. We are very close to own 100% 1.3 gigawatt renewable electricity in operation already. And we are planning to finance the development of further 800 megawatt the next years. But what we have experienced lately is that some of the projects are not in the money, so to speak, anymore, and slow permitting from the authorities has also delayed the construction of other projects. Finally, I think we will focus more than we have done before on how to adapt to a warmer economy. We will certainly put more emphasis on climate risk on our real assets, property, infrastructure assets. We will be more curious to look in adaptation technologies. Are there some interesting prospects for us as investors to earn a good return here? And finally, but not least, we will look into renewables. In fact, we already are participating in a pilot on pyrolysis, and we will be curious to look at the BECCS bioenergy with carbon and storage. So I think that is the way we are considering how to adapt at the moment.
Fantastic. Thanks, Jan. So I think three things for me there, kind of policy, thinking about the urgency, we have to now be looking at adaptation and then as well on the removal side. So thank you. Hishida-san, can I maybe turn to you from an asset management perspective, and also where you have the net zero commitments, a member of the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. What's your take on this?
Okay, thank you much. Good morning, and I'm very honored to have had this opportunity to talk about our thought and strategy for climate and nature. And by the way, please call me Yoshio instead of Hishida-san, since my last name is Hishida, of course, but pronunciation is very, very similar to our Prime Minister Kishida. Honestly, it's confusing to me as well. So please call me Yoshio.
Yoshio.
Sorry.
Thank you.
And actually, we are one of the largest asset managers in Asia, and we demonstrate leadership. And of particular note, we are making an impact on the investment management industry through top management engagement that include myself, as well as by taking a lead role in various global initiatives. We have been focusing on stewardship activities mainly on climate change risk and nature. We have been actively participating in this area and are able to conduct comprehensive engagement through our 3 regional bases in Japan, as well as in Europe and in New York, in the States. To give you a couple of examples, we served as a member of the steering committee for CA100+ and promoted collaborative engagement as its lead manager. In addition, we are the only Japanese participant in the IPDD, Investors Policy Dialogue on Deforestation, and promoted policy engagement with the Brazilian and Indonesian government to prevent deforestation. We joined the Net Zero Asset Manager Initiative in 2021 and announced our commitment, as well as set 2030 interim target through the initiative by using the net zero investment framework, which aims to cut carbon footprint by a half. We believe climate change risk can't be completely eliminated through the diversification of the portfolio itself, and is likely to become more serious in the future. So it is important to address it with everyone's participation. To address this issue, I have spoken twice at the seminars sponsored by the Investment Trust Association of Japan, calling for Japanese asset managers to join NZAM. Finally, as already discussed, urgent climate action is needed to halve emissions by 2030. This means that next few years are critical, and evidence is clear. I would like to say that the time for action is now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really interesting to hear about all the different work that, that your organisation is involved with. Heather, can I turn to you then now to give a civil society perspective? Very conscious, WWF has been engaging with businesses and governments for decades now on the urgency of taking action on climate change, and in particular around that interface between climate and nature. What's your view on what the investment community could and should be doing to tackle climate change, given, as Professor Skier was saying, the urgency of action as we're getting closer to 1.5 degrees?
Great, thanks, Tamsin. Yes, as one of the largest international conservation organizations, WWF is focused on conserving critical ecosystems and biodiversity hotspots around the world. We also are focused on reducing the threats that are posed to diversity on life on Earth. So to do this, we really leverage our organization's global footprint. As you said, we're in over 100 countries around the world, and we work with communities on the front lines of conservation. I think for this conversation and a particular relevance to this audience, we also engage directly with major systems drivers, policymakers and governments, financial institutions, and corporates that are at the center of the energy and commodity markets. And one of the issues that WWF has really been focused on in recent years, and that we see real potential for investors to influence, is around sustainable food production, as both on land and sea, given the huge implications this has for people and for nature, and the fact that food is one of the sectors most impacted by climate change. The science suggests a 10 to 15% decline in net primary productivity by the year 2050, affecting both food and nature, and we'll also have 2 billion more people to feed who will be consuming more and consuming differently, putting people, finance, and livelihoods at risk. It's important to note also traditional agriculture contributes 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions annually, and the agriculture expansion from forest risk commodities like beef, soy, palm oil are responsible for 83% of forest loss in 2021 on alone. So this has huge impacts on biodiversity loss, on food production, as they both depend on the ecosystems and the services that they provide. So I guess one of my main messages is for the many investors who've committed to achieving alignment with a 1.5 degree goal, it's an absolute must to eliminate deforestation from your portfolios, particularly in the near term, as Professor Skier was saying. And even if all other emissions were halted, if deforestation remains unchecked, we'll be on a path to 2 degrees in this century and causing trillions of damage globally, economically. So it is important. It's not all doom and gloom, though. There is good news. There's emerging expectations for corporates to take action on nature and climate, and companies increasingly are being expected to embed these issues into their business decisions and drive change through their supply chains. And we'll hear a lot more about that, about the TNFD. And as you also know, financial institutions have a fiduciary responsibility to their clients and their shareholders to manage these risks and manage their risk exposure. And this has begun to mean integrating climate and nature into capital allocation and investment decisions, as ESG reports are increasingly becoming a company's license to operate. So the evidence for this is becoming ever clearer. We see in a recent World Economic Forum analysis that $44 trillion of economic value generation, which is over half the world's total GDP, is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services. As it's been said, climate and nature are material risks. Now is the time to really focus on implementing transition plans, as we can't really diversify away these risks any longer. And they're also posing key regulatory, operational, reputational risks to financial institutions. And I just wanted to point out, in terms of the regulatory risks, climate-related financial disclosures and due diligence regulations are transitioning from voluntary to mandatory in some cases. One example of this that we're probably all dealing with is the EU deforestation regulation, or the EUDR, that's coming into force and will put import restrictions on companies that have anything to do with deforestation. Similar regulations are also being considered in the UK and in California. So companies will be required to inform their investors about their climate risks, and specifically the risks around deforestation. So given this context and kind of the emerging expectations and the demands being put on financial institutions, it's clear that the investment community should really prioritize eliminating deforestation in order to address climate change and tackle the nature crisis.
Great, thank you, Heather, for giving some kind of very tangible examples of those material risks and our dependence on nature as well. If we can now just go into a bit more of the detail in terms of some of those actions that investors can be taking. And if we can maybe start by thinking about the energy system. Given where we are, what are some of the priority actions that investors should be taking when we think about the transition in the energy sector? Yoshida, can I maybe start with you, please? Sorry, I probably mispronounced.
Okay. Actually, if we take a look at our entire equity portfolio, which counts for about $300 billion US, actually 45% of the total greenhouse gas emissions are coming from Asian region. Therefore, climate change-related engagement in Asia is especially important to us. And we have been actively participating not only in CA 100+, but also in AIGCC's Asian Utilities Engagement Program and Forest and Land Use Working Group as well. As an example, let me explain about our engagement with a Korean steel company, for instance. We have been engaging with the company and utilize comprehensive capabilities, including suggestions to Korean policymakers and collaboration with Korean investors, as well as asset owners in Europe to accomplish this. As part of its corporate action, the company finally announced the goal of net zero GHG emissions and disclosed plans in consideration of the 1.5-degree scenario and disclosed detailed policies. I would also like to touch upon our disclosure. We published a clear and robust climate action plan in our strategy report using the ICAP's framework. And our action was introduced as the first case study focusing on ICAP best practice in 2021. Lastly, I want to touch upon our voting policy on climate change. In exercising our voting rights, we have a policy of opposing proposals for the appointment of directors for portfolio companies that emit relatively high GHG emission that makes little effort to disclose climate-related information or set target and provide no reasonable explanation for this. Through this combination of engagement and proxy voting, we are demonstrating leadership in enhancing our portfolio companies to reduce emissions and achieve a net zero society. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Really interesting to hear about, again, a very tangible example with that steel company. Jan, can I get your perspectives on this, on the energy sector and the priorities?
Yes, first I think we need to recognize that the gold rush in renewable energy is over. And the reason is that we have had high inflation for almost 2 years that had driven construction costs up. It can probably be a temporary, we hope it's a temporary phenomenon to some extent, but more important, the rising interest rates are also making it more expensive and difficult to finance huge renewable energy projects. And on this background, I think we need also to have authorities and governments that are demanders of renewable energy solutions to understand that we need adequate pricing on renewable projects in order to develop them. I think we also need to look at the need for subsidies to immature technologies of today. We talked about some of the removal technologies that maybe will have to probably will have to be developed and scaled in the coming decades. So we need subsidies, infant subsidies to reach that. But right now, with the technology we have, it is, as it also was said by Mr. Jimsky, very important to put renewable technology to the global south. This is at the heart of my understanding of what a just transition is. Because, of course, all the people living in the global south, they have a fair and just desire to realize economic growth and have, example given, access to stable electricity like we have. What we should strive for is to make this growth green. And that is so important that the developing countries are making their part, paying the $100 billion a year to the global south so that they can make the necessary investments in leapfrogging a fossil phase and come into a renewable and clean energy system that will help them experience a high level of growth and poverty. As investors, we shall of course take part in this. We can do it through participating in blended finance structures. There are a lot of them growing in the world. It could either be with debt or equity finance. And I certainly think there are some good options for us here because the catalytic capital is de-risking for us. So we can participate and still fulfill our fiduciary duty. I've one last point. When we look at the energy system, I think sometimes we talk too much about the supply. What would be a main driver is, of course, that demand change. So the prospect of having electric vehicles, to have Mr. Fumio talked yesterday about low carbon steel production. I think to look at the demand side, decarbonizing demand is a very important driver to reach a clean energy system in the future. And we as investors should be aware of the investment possibilities and opportunities in clean, in the demand side, and also when we engage with companies and to put their attention and direct their attention towards clean solutions.
Great, thank you, Jan. So policy, green growth, and thinking about just transition in the global south, and thinking about the demand measures, not just the supply. Thank you. So if we can now take a similar deep dive focus looking at nature and thinking about the role of nature in the net zero transition. Now, Heather, you've already touched on this, on its importance, but any examples, practical examples of kind of actions that can be taken in this sector by investors?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think something that people are really looking toward, what can they do in the near term? And there are really two key things to keep in mind that are imperative to getting to 1.5 by 2030. And those are phasing out of fossil fuel burning and ending destructive farming practices. And what that means is really ending coal and ending deforestation. And these are definitely needed to keep in alignment with the Paris Agreement, as well as achieve the high ambitions set in the global biodiversity framework. To get a little more specific and talk about the central role that investors can play and what actions they can prioritize around nature and climate, I want to focus on achieving the deforestation and conversion-free supply chains. And first, it's really important for investors to understand and manage their risk exposure and eliminate deforestation and conversion and associated human rights abuses from their supply chain and from their portfolios by 2025. This requires paying particular attention to the investments in specific high-risk geographies, because that's where really a lot of this is happening. And once the risks are understood, investors should set clear policies around deforestation and conversion and human rights that cover all financing activities, as well as set science-based targets that are aligned with the Paris Agreement. To ensure accountability and transparency, it's also advised that investors prioritize their climate-related financial disclosures and disclose Scope 3 emissions. This includes publishing your own deforestation risk and exposure, and also requiring your portfolio companies to disclose these risks and talk about their management plans, as well as those for their nature-related risks, as are in line with the new TNFD recommendations we'll hear in more detail from Tony. So there's a lot of guidance out there on how to do this. And then in terms of engagement, which we talk about a lot, investors are advised to actively engage with their investee companies on these issues, on deforestation, conversion, human rights, and require them also to set and implement these types of policies. And then finally, I think we can't undermine or underscore the importance of the policy piece and engaging on policy, advocating for ambitious policy and standards to create that enabling environment to bring along the global financial sector, so that we are working with policymakers and regulators to make a just transition happen. And we're doing a lot of this at WWF, working with financial institutions and companies to embed the science, working into their transition plans and into the targets, working with efforts like Science-Based Targets Initiative and TNFD to really help move the transition forward.
Great, thank you very much, Heather.
Yeah.
Some really practical pieces there. Jan, can I get your thoughts on this from an investor perspective, on some of the priority actions that you've been considering in this space?
Yes, we certainly recognize what has been said, that every fraction of a degree counts, and when we must limit global warming. And the main reason for that is nature and biodiversity, because lost biodiversity cannot be reversed. So with that in mind, I think we are looking towards carve out how we can get good economics for us as investors when we try to avoid deforestation, when we try to raise more forest, and also try to restore wetland and peatlands. And how this can be good economics for us is, I think it's not very clear yet. I think it's another dimension where policy action needs to happen. But that's not to say we're not doing anything, because we have started with looking at our real assets where we are controlling owners. We own most of our property 100%. Our real estate portfolio is owned 100%, and we have made the promise that all new project developments from property shall be nature positive by 2030, that we are developing last year and this year. And nature positive is there's not a global standard for that concept yet, but we're using a concept that has been developed by universities in Denmark and England. We have a third party that measures nature and biodiversity on the site, and the results are audited once a year in our sustainability reports. So that's what we can do now ourselves, where there are some assets we can control and where we have, so to speak, food on the ground. Feet on the ground. Food on the ground would be nice as well. The other real asset for us that we would like to try to work with biodiversity is infrastructure. And we have pilots on development of offshore wind farms where we can see how offshore wind farms, if we tilt construction a little bit, if they can have a positive impact on ocean life. These projects are not made because we're hippies. They're made because we believe that there will be a demand for nature-positive solutions from property and infrastructure, whether the buyer are private or governments. Finally, we certainly appreciate the collaborative engagements initiatives that are coming out at the moment. We are in NA100, and we also participate in the prioritise stewardship collaboration initiative on nature that is about to be launched. We think it's very important, but again, the stewardship should not only be towards companies, it should also be towards governments, and that's really important. And I must say that we are thrilled and excited by the TNFD, and we will certainly use it and implement it in our reporting. And we think it's a very good start to focus on location and sectors. Look forward to hear more about it.
Thank you, Jan. Very helpful in setting out, recognising there are still challenges in thinking about how we look at nature. But I think really interesting to hear the practical things that you are able to do and you are doing to move that agenda forward. So thank you. Yastida, can I get your thoughts on this as well, please?
Okay. We also recognize climate change and natural capital are interrelated. Thus, addressing the natural sector is also an urgent matter to achieve net zero by 2050. As a member of the PRI Palm Oil Working Group, we have been focusing on the natural capital area. Currently, we are participating in Nature Action 100+ to halt the loss of nature and biodiversity and to restore them by 2030. We are also participating in PRI stewardship initiatives on nature as well, as an advisory committee member. Through these initiatives, we are also taking a leadership role in the area of natural capital. Let me then explain our activities on the natural capital area. As mentioned, we also took the role of one of the lead investors in the IPDD. In addition, we have been actively participating in collaborative policy engagement around deforestation and were the only Japanese investment manager signatory in the financial sector commitment letter on eliminating commodity-driven deforestation. We have also taken steps to strengthen palm oil sector supply chain monitoring. We encourage companies to thoroughly comply with NDPE, or no deforestation, no peat, and no exploitation policies in their supply chain, and recommend participation and certification from the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, or RSPO. An example includes engagement with a major Asian bank, which result in 45% of banks' customers in the palm oil sector supply chain committing to NDPE and 5% committing to RSPO, for example. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And really interesting to hear about all the different collaboration opportunities that you're engaged with and that are out there for others to also participate in. So thank you very much for that perspective from the investor side. I'd now like to switch to get more of an industry perspective. Yeah. So Wayama-san, would you be happy just to explain a bit more as to kind of why and how is Kao Corporation looking at addressing climate and nature issues?
Okay. それではまず最初に And then, first of all, I feel very honored and I would like to express appreciation to be given this opportunity to speak. The company was founded in 1887. We provide detergent, shampoo, diapers, and cosmetics, personal care products. And we also have surfactants and also oils, such as palm oil, paper, water. We are benefiting from nature to grow our business. So since the founding of the company, we are supporting consumers and we are conscious about nature and environment sustainability in our business. In Kao Way, in our corporate philosophy, to achieve affluent society and the lives of everyone to be harmonized and to create the future. That is the purpose of the company. And this purpose, in order to achieve this purpose, cleanliness is something that we are prioritizing, but we are trying to have a clean life in our mind as well. Literally, kirei life in Japanese. So for society and also for the earth, the ESG strategy, a clean lifestyle plan is something that we have formulated. And in line with this ESG strategy, ESG perspective, where the consumers played a major role, we are strongly conscious about that. So ESG perspective is taken into manufacturing to achieve sustainable society. This is the area of focus. Under such circumstances, decarbonization, as was mentioned earlier, in our clean lifestyle plan, this is one of the priorities. In 2040, carbon net zero, and in 2050, carbon negative is the roadmap that we have prepared, and that is already published and disclosed within our report. And the CO2 reduction by 2030 is based on science-based target and the specific figures. And the amount of reduction is already disclosed in the sustainability report. We have ambitious targets. And in order to achieve such ambitious goals, not simply reducing CO2, but we need to fix CO2, and we feel it is essential to have the technological breakthrough. For the collaboration outside of the company, we are making effort to deliver breakthrough. And as was mentioned earlier, we are heavily dependent on nature products such as palm oil. So this is another area we need to address. At the plantation level, RCPO, as was mentioned earlier, consumer products, all using RSPO certified products, but the traceability or small scale farms, productivity should be enhanced, and as much as possible, impact and dependency to nature should be reduced. So various KPIs and the goals are now set in order to do our activities. And this is also raised from earlier, but nature and decarbonization, climate change, in order to tackle such issues, plastic waste. We are targeting for zero plastic waste. And we are trying to look for recycling of the resources, biodiversity, climate change, and nature circulation. They are interconnected. In order to achieve a genuinely sustainable society, from these three holistic perspectives, we need to have an integrated method. So this is the response to question 1.
Very interesting to hear about both the not just net zero targets, but negative targets, which is very inspiring, and also on the zero plastic waste. So thank you. Could you give us a couple of practical examples of some of the challenges in doing this? What were some of the challenges that you came across, and how did you overcome those?
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Decarbonization. The biggest challenge at Kao is the reduction of scope 3. If you take a look at our life cycle assessment, 40% of CO2 reduction is in the area of consumers. And toward that, if I may just introduce one example, our surfactant technology is being used. And for rinsing off, normally we require to have 2 rinse off for the detergent for clothes, and by reducing that, we were able to reduce the CO2 emission by 30%. So clean and a comfortable life to be enjoyed by the customers and in a sustainable way is something that we are introducing in developing our products. With respect to supply chain, we have been mentioning about the palm oil, but this is one of our major raw materials that we use. But deforestation is the issue here. Of course, we are strengthening traceability, needless to say, but currently, palm oil is used for our detergents, but bio-IOS is what we uniquely developed, and the residual after extracting or squeezing palm oil, this is something that we use as important products. So through these important technological breakthrough, we are trying to minimize the deforestation and a cleaner, sustainable lifestyle to be proposed to consumers. In addition to that, for plastic packages, before these plastic issues became critical from 1990s, we were trying to develop compact packages for household products and refill products of the pouches. We were aggressive in introducing them. If compared with no measure taken, a 74% reduction, roughly 100,000 tons of the plastic has been reduced. Bottle-to-bottle process recycling, how should that be developed is another issue. This may, although the scale of the project is small, bottle-to-bottle product is used, and we have already launched such products. We are also trying to scale up this project and to retailers, distributors, and also with community. We would like to be aligned with each other to recover the packages after use. So including such aspects, the circulation of the plastic is what we are targeting. Attack Zero is the name of the product for our detergent. You just need to have a one rinse off, and also BioOS and recycle plastic. They are all introduced and launched in the market. What is critical is at the time of the designing of the product, ESG perspective should be taken into consideration. And from the sustainable point of view, more comfortable lifestyle and the new values should be proposed to consumers. So that will be solving the social issues, and it would also help to grow our business. That is all from me.
Thank you very much. Some really interesting examples there around innovation, efficiency, and really impressive hearing that the targets again in terms of what is being saved there. So thank you very much for that. Just one final very brief answer here. In thinking about what actions do you need, in particular thinking about our audience and the investment community, to really help drive the system change that's required for this?
Yes. In order to achieve the sustainable society, the life cycle, a grand design for the entire life cycle is important, and we need to collaborate with various stakeholders and link this to the business. So bearing that in mind, we need to build a new system and take action to build the new system. That is crucial. And to do that, the consumers, business, government, local government, all stakeholders need to be involved. We need to collaborate with all parties. As mentioned earlier, government and the policymakers, various market players are taking effective and quick innovation. So the fair level playing field, the new system and laws need to be established and reformed, and they will play an important role to have this level playing field. Manufacturer needs to approach to make that happen. And this kind of social system change will entail industrial change, big change in the industry. So we do not want excessive burden on the weak, the vulnerables. So the human rights perspective needs to be included in the grand design from the outset. This perspective needs to be included from the very beginning. Temporary subsidy is not the answer. The industrial structure needs to be made more resilient. So such activity and support will be necessary. Thank you. That's all.
Some very interesting insights there. Tony, if I can turn to you, and thank you for your patience. TNFD recommendations, we're coming to the details in a moment, but I know as you were developing the approach to TNFD, you worked very closely with more than 200 investors and corporates that volunteered to test and pilot the approach. Can you tell us through that experience any insights that you got in terms of why were they willing and keen to be looking at nature risks, and thinking about the net zero transition, and building on what you've heard from our other panelists this morning?
Yeah, thanks, Tamsin. I think what's been really interesting from our design and development process over the last 2 years is just the huge level of market participation. As you said, we had over actually 240 plus organizations doing 200 pilot tests. Some organizations actually teamed up and did them together, including asset managers and investees, which I think were really interesting combinations. And I think people came at it from a number of different perspectives. And even in the last 24 hours here at PRI, I'm hearing two very different views. Some universal asset owners have sort of come towards us very enthusiastically, saying we're in every sector, we're in every geography, we're across asset classes. And one of my favorite quotes from the last 2 years is, "We have nowhere to hide from nature risk." That was from a universal asset owner. But I'm also hearing the view that we're still working our way through climate, there's no data, the nature stuff's just going to have to wait. And so I think there really are at the moment two very different views. What we've heard from pilot testing, I think, and the most profound insight for me is just the way pilot testing has shifted those attitudes. And I think we've seen a really marked shift from nature being seen as a corporate social responsibility issue to a strategic risk management issue. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. And to the point about deforestation, in our guidance, which we published 2 weeks ago when we launched the recommendations at New York Climate Week, we've included a number of case studies. And one of the case studies from an asset manager was using our approach specifically to look for deforestation risk through their portfolio. And to the point that there's no data, using Encore and IBAT and a number of other well-established sources, they managed to isolate key investee companies that were contributing to deforestation in particular locations around the world. And our focus is very specific on the need to get to to location. And they were able to get to very precise insights around which companies do we need to be having conversations with, to the stewardship point. Where are they operating? What kind of risks does it create to their business and their cash flows? And what kind of risk does it create for us as an asset manager? And so I think, the big takeaway has been just this change in attitude, that once you put your feet in the water and get started with pilot testing, with looking for nature-related issues, it is possible. There's actually tons of data out there, and the insights can be incredibly helpful, both in terms of thinking about risk, thinking about opportunity, and thinking about stewardship action and stewardship strategies that asset managers and asset owners should be looking at. So I think the big takeaway has just been the shift in attitude and breaking down this perception that there's no data, so it's too early and we can't do this. There's actually a lot of data out there. I think the real barrier is that nature as a risk management topic is new. And so there's actually right now quite a low level of familiarity about where to find the data. It's not that it's not there. And there's certainly gaps, and we've got lots of people and initiatives trying to fix those issues. But I think once people start looking, see what's there, use what's there, it can actually be a source of generating some very important insights and getting started. And at a company level, what we learnt from the pilot testing, again, to shifting attitudes, we had a couple of companies that have a really good sense of their climate-related risk, even the value of the climate-related risk to the corporation. We had a couple of pilot testers work right through the assessment process that we've proposed. They even went further than our guidance in attempting to quantify their nature-related risks, and they found that the dollar value of the nature risk is bigger than their climate risk that they're managing right now. And frankly, we shouldn't be surprised that that would be the outcome for businesses like consumer goods or forestry or other sectors. But once the relative perception of climate risk and nature risk is coming into view, it then quickly changes a sense of prioritization, because of course everyone's very focused on climate risk, but you might have an even bigger issue out there that needs to be thought through and managed. And we're now providing the tools to enable people to start to do that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tony. So very much kind of get your feet in the water, because there is enough out there now to be moving. Could you tell us a bit more about the TNFD recommendations, which, as you say, you launched in September last month, and congratulations again for a fantastic launch. Can you just tell us a little bit about those recommendations?
Sure. I think you can break it down into two basic parts. So one is a set of disclosure recommendations. So what are we recommending that the company should be disclosing to you as investors and to other users of financial reports? We explicitly built on top of the TCFD recommendations. So all 11 TCFD recommendations, the task force decided were relevant in the nature context, and we simply carried those across. We then added 3 additional disclosures that we thought were particularly relevant to the nature context. One around value chains, one around stakeholder engagement, and particularly with Indigenous people and local communities who manage 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. And the third one is in relation to where a business or a financed portfolio is interfacing with particularly sensitive locations. And we've heard some examples of that today. So water-stressed areas, areas of key biodiversity value, protected areas, etc. But the key point is that we've built on top of TCFD. And the key takeaway I want to leave with everyone today is if you're already doing TCFD, you're actually really well positioned to start disclosing on your nature-related issues. And most of you will know that half of the TCFD disclosures are qualitative, process-oriented statements about how you're managing governance, risk management, etc. So even if you're struggling on the data side to quantify particular aspects, there's already ways to get started in terms of describing how the organisation is looking at this from a governance perspective or from a risk management perspective. So we built on TCFD. We also have had excellent collaboration with the ISSB and the GRI. And so looking ahead, now that TCFD has sunsetted, we've also aligned the language with the new ISSB S1 and S2 standards. And we've also reflected the GRI impact-related standards as well. So we're looking ahead. We've designed these for the future. Of course, TNFD, like TCFD, is not a standard setter. We are providing a set of recommendations. One of the pathways to impact for us, obviously, is if the voluntary standard setters reflect on our work and build that into their next round of standards. And ISSB has said publicly that it's going to be looking at nature as a new source of standard setting in the next few years, and we fully support their efforts. But of course, while we're waiting for standards, we can't afford to wait on nature risk. The reality is that there's nature risk in your portfolios today. And I think the worst outcome is if everyone sits back and says, well, we'll just wait for the standards to appear in a few years' time. We have to get started now. And so in a sense, it's exactly the same as TCFD. And we're already seeing companies in the last 2 weeks stepping forward, as well as asset managers and asset owners, saying we're going to start adopting the TNFD recommendations while the voluntary standards are developed, and of course while governments are also considering the recommendations. But I think the key point is there's nature risk in cash flows, there's nature risk in balance sheets, and there's nature risk in investment portfolios today. You just haven't had the tools to see it. And one of the things we've tried to do with TNFD is not just provide those disclosure recommendations, but also an assessment process, almost like a flashlight, to start to see those risks. Because, of course, if you can see them and you understand what they are, then you're in a position to manage them. So disclosure recommendations and assessment guidance. And I think the key thing is get started where you can. Appreciate this is a new journey and nature is a new topic from a business and finance perspective. But the risk is there and it needs to start to be managed because we're seeing the consequences of that. And we've heard from the scientists that 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries have been breached. And both the frequency and the magnitude of nature and climate-related risks are increasing, and we need to take urgent action.
Great. Thank you very much, Tony. And as you say, coming back to the point we started with on thinking about some of those synergies and efficiencies on looking at nature and climate together and thinking, as you say, about the TCFD and the TNFD approach there. So Tony will be leading a breakout session tomorrow. If you want to find out more about the TNFD recommendations and how to get started, do please join that session tomorrow. So we are nearly out of time. So the very last, very quick fire question, the same question that we put to Professor Skier in terms of what gives you hope and what's the one priority action you would encourage others to take? Tony, can I start with you?
Well, I'm very excited about the need and the opportunity to scale up nature-based solutions. And I actually had the last 7 minutes at PRI last year in Barcelona, so it's nice to be here on day 2 this year. But as I said last year, I think the solution actually lies with the people in this room. What we have to do is figure out a way to better pair up the scientists with the knowledge of nature and people in finance who know how to bring structured solutions to complicated problems and deploy capital. And I think we're only at the beginning of putting those 2 things together. There's a huge amount of opportunity there. So I'm very positive about the opportunity to keep experimenting, innovating, trying different models. There's clearly some very exciting nature-based solutions out there, but most of them are quite small, if we're honest, and the big money is still sitting on the sidelines, waiting for opportunities at scale. And I think that's really the opportunity we have to go for now.
Great. Thank you, Tony. Heather.
Yeah, great. I'm optimistic that we can really eliminate deforestation from portfolios and supply chains. like maybe too hopeful by 2025, but there's evidence out there pointing in that direction. We're seeing that in the scenario work from the IPR, the inevitable policy response. Plus, it's one of the near-term ways to really reduce Scope 3 emissions, in a major way. I know it's pretty overwhelming to think about all of the work and challenges ahead to do this, but I think we should take kind of a pause and think about how quickly the momentum is building and how much nature is now part of the finance agenda, which it wasn't a couple of years ago. So that is hopeful for sure. I think we really need to, we've heard about shifting from kind of discussion to implementation, and that needs to urgently happen. And investors and finance institutions have a real role to play there, using their leverage and their capital to make that shift happen. I also think the time of kind of generic intention letters has passed, so action is needed. And every day, these risks around social, environmental, and the economic risks of nature loss are being better understood and realized on balance sheets. So the call is for investors to really recognize their power here, work together. We can't do this alone. I liked how Tony was saying putting together the finance and the science together. I did not ask him to say that, but that's what we're here for. And really get involved with these nature-focused investor platforms. We're going to hear more about them throughout the conference, but there are many. The newly launched PRI Stewardship Initiative on Nature, Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, Net Zero Asset Manager, GFANS, the FAIR engagements around protein and seafoods traceability, the Finance Sector Deforestation Action, or FSDA group. There are a lot. I'm sorry if I've missed a few. And just a final, there you go. And just kind of a final note to wrap up. I think kind of the greatest threat to nature is inaction. So the call is to act now, and WWF is here to support that.
Thank you. Oyama-san.
Yeah, thank you. And 現在、いろん
Thank you. Currently, many companies and many institutions are trying to work on innovation of decarbonization, and we're beginning to witness excellent technologies. But at this point in time, they are still working on their own initiative from their own perspective. If we can be aligned with each other, and if we can collaborate together, we can deliver major synergy, and we should be able to have a major movement, and we should be able to abide by a Paris Agreement. If we can support these alignment, this kind of opportunity for engagement like today is extremely important. And innovation for sustainability is very difficult to obtain return on the short term. In many cases, we need to have more time. So this is a message to investors. There are industry unique investment strategy. And I hope that you would also have a mid to long-term commitment. And we hope to have a constructive discussion. Thank you very much for your support.
And Asida.
Yes, actually, I remain optimistic in that many companies are actually moving toward net zero. And as I said, the challenge is in Asia. And we know it's not easy to reduce GHG emissions while continuing to grow. Hence, cooperation and collaboration will be necessary. And furthermore, my hope also comes from the progress we have seen for the past 17 years since the PRI was launched. And we are one of the founding members of PRI, and I still clearly remember being at the first annual meeting of PRI held in Geneva in 2006. I was there, actually, and maybe I was a bit young, and we are the only Japanese at that time in attendance. But today, we have a PRI in person here in Tokyo. I honestly believe the change and the progress has been overwhelming, and we would like to demonstrate our clear leadership and confront the various issues, and we believe we can do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And finally, Jan.
It is indeed really good to be here in Tokyo. Well, I think that in the last year or two, we have seen huge progress in how the financial sector approach nature and biodiversity. I think this is a really positive development, and it has to continue, of course, but it's a very good beginning. And I think also we are pretty fair convinced about the strong nexus between climate, nature, and biodiversity. This is also a very good recognition for us as investors. Another positive is that technology has given us a lot of the solutions. It was also said by the IPCC chair. It's not that the climate challenge is impossible to solve. We have most of the tools already. And every month we experience as investors about a new fantastic technology entering the market. We talked about low carbon steel, but I can say 2 weeks ago, the first big container ship sailed into the harbor of Copenhagen, fueled on green methanol. Before it was considered a hard to abate sector, but we are already there with technology solutions. Battery technology is improving a lot, and it's almost certain that within a maximum of 20 years, we will have electric vehicles all over. So many promising things for technology, so many interesting investment possibilities for investors, but we need more policy action to achieve what we really want. And that's what we lack at the moment.
Thank you, Jan. So we are out of time. So I just want to say thank you very much, everyone, for sharing your expertise and your insights. I think just very briefly to wrap up a few of the key themes that we've been discussing. Urgency of action. Every fraction of a degree counts and time is of the essence. We do have a breakout session later this afternoon that is looking at 1.5 degree pathways if you want to know more on that. Second, holistic action. The only way that we can limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, absolutely we have to be looking at decarbonising the energy sector, but we also have to be protecting our natural carbon sinks, and we have to be thinking about how to do this in a fair and equitable way. Third, policy. We have to get the right enabling environment in order to be able to move at the speed and the scale that is required. Fourth, the thing that gives me hope, we have the solutions. I think that came out loud and clear from all of you, from Professor Skier and from some of the plenaries yesterday. We know what needs to be done. We've got the tools, we've got the technology, we've got the finance, so let's get on and do it. And then finally, collaboration, better together. We can move at a much greater pace and at scale by coming together and doing this together. And on that, my final point is to say that I'm very pleased to announce, it's been touched on already, that PRI is launching a new initiative, a new stewardship initiative that's focused on nature. I don't need to reiterate why nature is so important, beyond saying it's critical for climate, for people, for economies, and for investment returns. The new initiative Spring is going to be focusing on land loss and forest loss and land degradation initially, very much in recognition that these are key drivers of nature and biodiversity loss and, of course, contributing significantly to climate change. The initiative is going to be focusing around companies' political engagement and lobbying and how to ensure that's in line with investors' expectations on having a healthy ecosystems and a safe climate. Responsible political engagement is absolutely critical to help enable the sound policy, public policy environment that, as we've just been discussing, is so critical. We're launching today an investor statement for signatory endorsement. This should be live now on the PRI website as well as on the PRI collaboration platform. And it sets out high-level expectations for companies in terms of business operations, supply chain management, and in terms of responsible political engagement practices. So do please take a look. And if you'd like to know anything more about Spring, the investor statement, and hearing about some of the other partner nature initiatives that have also been touched on, please do join the breakout session that we have this afternoon. And on that, I'd like to say thank you very much again for your time and for all of your inputs. Thank you.